Hi, I'm Tom Hayes, and I'll be telling you about energy complexity of breadth-first search in radio networks. This is joint work with my co-authors Yi-Jun Chang, Varsha Dani, and Seth Pettie. Imagine we're in this beautiful forest, and there's a network of sensors sitting there. Okay, they can communicate with each other by radio. Suddenly, one of them detects a fire nearby and sends out a signal. The signal is picked up by other sensors nearby and forwarded on because it's important to get the word out about this fire. Okay, so fairly soon everyone knows, and hopefully some kind of appropriate action can be taken. So this is a setting we're interested in, not necessarily forests, but we have a network of cheap sensors. They're not sort of carefully positioned, but just tossed everywhere. And they can communicate with each other wirelessly and have limited power. So our assumption is that local computation at the sensors is cheap, but the dominant cost is communication between sensors, which drains the battery. A difference between our work and previous models of energy-aware computation is that previously most models counted only the number of transmissions and perhaps the size of them, but we're concerned with the cost of keeping our transistor turned on so that we can receive messages, because listening uses energy too, especially on small devices. And in particular, as the size of these devices scales down, it's been found that the cost of using the receiver is comparable for individual messages to the cost of using the sender to broadcast them. So adaptively turning off the receiver as well as the broadcaster can significantly prolong the battery life of your sensors. Okay, let's start with a toy example. Say I want to send a message from one node in my network to all the other nodes in the network. And suppose my radio transmitters are not strong enough to send more than one sort of one unit away in this network. So the way my broadcast protocol is going to work, it's just a naive breadth-first search. Everyone listens until one of their neighbors sends them a message, and we go boop, 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 straight across. Okay, it's a nice linear time algorithm, very simple. So I have n nodes in a line. Each one is going to send once, but the farthest one from the original message is going to have to listen n times until the message reaches them. Okay, and each of these sends and listens, remember, contributes to the main cost we're interested in, which is energy. Okay, here's another version of the same scenario, but this time the twist is that the individual sensors are allowed to go to sleep. So suppose they all start off asleep, and the ith node is going to wake up at time I. Well, node 1 has got this message he wants to send on. He sends it, and node 2 wakes up at just the right time to receive the message from node 1. Node 3 wakes up at just the right time to listen to a message from node 2, and so on. After they've sent the message onward, they can go back to sleep. So if we look at the energy analysis for this scenario, well, the total time taken is still the same. We haven't lost anything in terms of efficiency by going to sleep, each node still sends exactly once, but now the number of listens for the nodes has dropped from a maximum of n down to 1 because they are perfectly synchronized. Good. So what's the moral of the story? Well, the first thing is that your nodes can save a lot of energy by going to sleep and not listening all the time. The second moral is that knowing something about the graph you're in can make a huge difference. Why did our nodes save so much energy? It was because they knew exactly how far they were from the source node, and they could wake up at just the right time in order to receive the message that was coming for them. Well, if we don't know what the graph is, can we somehow infer when it's safe to sleep and when it's important to be awake and listening in case a message is coming for us? So we'd like to give each vertex a schedule of when to sleep and when to wake up and listen so that they can hear the transmissions from their neighbors, but at the same time save as much power as possible. So here's the model we're going to be working in specifically. We have a graph on n devices. None of the nodes know the topology of this graph to begin with. And an edge between two nodes means that they're in transmission range of each other. Now, each time a node sends or listens, it costs 1 unit of energy. The sending of a message is not along a specific edge, but a node simply decides that it's going to send a message, and that message will be received by all adjacent nodes that happen to be listening, except if more than one node is sending, which is in range of you, then there's going to be a collision where you don't get to receive any of those messages. Okay. Now, finally, our goal is to get energy efficient network protocols. And ideally, what this means is that the running time will be polynomial in the size of the graph, but the per node energy will be much smaller than that, so polylog of n. And specifically, we're going to be looking at protocols that solve the breadth-first search problem, which in our context means the following. So we start again with this arbitrary and completely unknown graph, which determines which nodes are within range of each other. We start with one designated vertex, the root, and we want a protocol that at the end of it, every vertex knows its exact shortest path distance to the root through this graph. The naive algorithm for breadth-first search would require each vertex to be awake for d time steps, where d is the diameter of this graph. And we want to know how we can, so d could be as much as linear in the number of nodes. We would like our vertices to sleep a lot more of that time so that we can get a sublinear total energy cost per node. Now, again, as our example showed, if we knew the answer, if we knew the distance of each vertex to the root node, then it could sleep the rest of the time, wake up at time f of v, which would be just the right time for the frontier to reach it and receive the message telling it how far it was. Of course, that's completely circular logic. This is the problem we're trying to solve, so obviously we don't know how long to sleep in sort of that ideal scenario. Well, our main result is that we have a breadth-first search algorithm. It runs in polynomial time and achieves a per node energy cost which is this funny function here. D is the diameter of the graph, n is the number of nodes. We have 2 to the square root of log d log n, which is subpolynomial. In particular, it's sublinear, which already makes it better than previously known algorithms to our knowledge. And this per node energy cost, although it's not polylog n, as I said, it's better than square root n, cube root n, or any other polynomial of n. Next, as a motivating example, I'd like to show you an animation of the breadth first search algorithm running on the square grid graph. It's color coded, so each of these little squares is a node. It's colored black if the node is sleeping, red if the node is sending, green if the node is listening. And if you can't tell the difference between the red and the green, it really doesn't matter, because each one is getting a unit energy cost. So what you'll see as we run it is the frontier advancing across the graph. And the nodes go to sleep after the frontier passes them, and they listen until the frontier reaches them. Now, at the top, we had the animation of the BFS one time step at a time. On the bottom square is showing the cumulative energy cost over time. So it's just sort of the sum of what you see in the steps on the top. So that cumulative energy cost on the bottom is what we're trying to minimize overall. And you notice at the end that you see sort of a brighter green at the places that had to wait longer for the frontier to reach them. There were a few nodes that got less of an energy cost because the frontier passed them very quickly. But overall, the per node energy cost was proportional to the diameter of the graph here. Okay, next I want to show you an unattainable but ideal scenario in which every node knows its distance from the start vertex and wakes up just in time. This is the example that we saw before on the line. And okay, the frontier expands as before, but the difference is that all these nodes that were before colored green, waiting for the frontier to reach them, this time they don't have to wait for the frontier to reach them. They can sleep during that time. And although they're waiting, they're not spending any energy. So what we see is that the cumulative energy cost on the bottom is just staying black, because it's practically nothing. Each node is only incurring a total cost of 2. One for a send, one for a receive. So that's ideal. Now, unfortunately, it's not feasible until after we've solved the breadth first search problem, because that's telling us the distance from the start vertex. So those two little animations are meant to motivate the main idea of our algorithm, which is to do clustering on the graph. If we split our graph into small clusters of nodes that are close to each other, and say we use the naive algorithm to solve the breadth first search problem on each cluster. So say each cluster is going to have a center vertex, and I want to know the distance of each node in the cluster from that center vertex. Once I've solved the breadth first search on the cluster, then I get that kind of ideal synchronization that you saw on the previous slide, where if I want to send information out from the center, then that information moves out like the frontier of a BFS. But all the nodes can sleep until just the right time when the information is about to reach them. And what this means is that a cluster can behave like a node, where information at any node in the cluster can be sent to the rest of the cluster and at a unit energy cost. So this allows us to treating these clusters as if they were single nodes. Then we can simulate a radio network on these clusters, where each cluster is going to communicate with the clusters that are adjacent to it. And now, if I'm running my BFS on the underlying graph, I can use this intercluster communication to shut down clusters and let them snooze until the breadth first search frontier is about to reach them. And by about to reach them, I mean it's already reached one of the adjacent clusters, or at least a nearby cluster. So when I say snooze, I don't mean sleep continuously. I mean sleep, except every now and then your snooze alarm goes off, wakes you up. When it wakes you up, you communicate with a nearby cluster, your nearby clusters, to see whether the frontier has reached any of them. And if it hasn't, you can go back to sleep, because it's going to be a while yet before the frontier reaches you. But if it has, then you can wake up and just stay awake until the frontier reaches you. Now I'd like to show you a demo of our basic clusters algorithm in action. Here we have two views of a 40 by 40 square grid graph. At the left, we have the basic graph. At the right, we're going to have a view that shows the clusters in it. And our algorithm, I'll step through it now. It begins with cluster formation. And it looks a bit like the naive algorithm for BFS. And at this point, I've gone past it, so the clusters are already formed. You see at the right, we have all these odd-shaped groups of the vertices which have now been shown joined together. Okay, so once we have our clusters, it's possible to view the main algorithm, which is the BFS and the underlying graph. And what the clusters enable us to do is, now most of the nodes here at left have turned black, which means they've gone to sleep. The nodes which are listening are members of the clusters that are fairly close to the root node. And as I step forward with the BFS frontier advancing, from time to time, the clusters are going to reevaluate how close they are to the frontier. And if they feel, once they feel they're close to the frontier, they will wake up and start listening. In other words, they're participating in the BFS algorithm. The clusters that assess that they're still far enough away from the frontier that they're not going to miss the arrival of the frontier at their boundary, they stay asleep. Okay, and this is the basic purpose of the clusters, is to determine when they're far enough from the frontier and enable their nodes to go to sleep. Okay. So that's at a very high level how our clusters algorithm is going to work. Now, let me go back and actually play it for you. So this is at a high speed playing. And what you can see is in between bursts where the frontier is advancing in the BFS algorithm and the underlying graph, we have a sort of synchronized communication occurring within the clusters. And that's how the clusters communicate with their neighbors and get the information about whether the frontier has reached their neighbor or whether the frontier is a distance 2 or more from their neighbor. And the last thing I want to point out here is that as the scaling increases, what we see is that, let me restart. What we see is that more and more of the nodes are staying black for more and more of the time due to the synchronization within clusters and the ability of the clusters that are far from the BFS frontier to go to sleep. Let me wrap up by recalling our main result, which is we have a new breadth-first search algorithm that runs in polynomial time and has a subpolynomial energy cost for each node. Okay, and in conclusion, we've proposed a new model of energy-aware computation in radio networks and shown some problems can be solved with much less energy in this setting. An obvious future direction is to look at other algorithms, basic computational protocols, which of these can be solved using polylog or at least subpolynomial energy problems such as leader election, consensus, Byzantine agreement, graph problems like matching, partitioning, routing, coloring, all seem like natural candidates, independent sets. Additionally, it would be nice if these algorithms are robust to noise, either adversarial or random, and things like node failures and nodes being added to or removed from the graph. Finally, my last slide. I'd like to ask you to, if you found this interesting, please watch the full talk. There's a lot of other neat stuff that didn't get included due to time constraints. One thing is a very surprising fact, which is that for any radius r, there's an efficient distributed cluster formation algorithm where distances in the cluster graph are directly proportional to distances in the original graph, in fact, scaled by r, up to a polylog n distortion, which is best possible. Do you believe it? Even the existence of such a set of clusters is not at all obvious. Another thing is you can learn about the sawtooth algorithm. If you think this looks like an interesting graphic, then why not watch the talk and learn more about it. But I will talk about hardness of diameter approximation, and there will be a recursive application of the clustering algorithm, so clusters of clusters of clusters of clusters, and so on. Thank you for your time.